Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. My next guest, Tony Daloisio, is an organizational psychologist, researcher, coach, and expert in leadership development. Most recently, he wrote his new book titled The Journeyman Life, The Not-So-Perfect Path to a Life Well Lived, which serves as a call to action to men. In his book, he utilizes his own vulnerable storytelling, blended with 30 years of experience and research, to help men explore the gap between their inner and outer selves and to illuminate the path to a life well lived. I greatly appreciate Tony's style of allowing his full humanity to be seen, while also encouraging other men to personally define what a life well lived looks like for them. The psychological safety that is created by being allowed to see the nuances of the author, while also being encouraged to explore one's own storytelling, is a striking element of his writing. I can't stress enough how much I am inspired by a man both showing up as the learner and the teacher all at once. On a personal level, Tony identifies as a person, as a leader, and as a husband. I'm thrilled to welcome him into the New Masculine, and for all of us to explore the journeyman life more deeply. Thanks for joining me, Tony.
Oh, thank you, Travis, and what a lovely introduction. I couldn't have said it any better.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Is there anything that I didn't share that feels important to bring up before we jump into this conversation?
I think just to underline how recently somebody asked me the question, what have you learned since you wrote the book? Which was I wrote it during the pandemic, so it was, a little really about a year ago. And, in order to write a book, obviously, I spent a lot of time sort of figuring out what I thought about the things I was writing about and researching them, which was great. But in reality, I may have learned the most important part since writing the book, actually, in the last several months, because I really did make a commitment to live the sort of principles and tools that I had written about, and started deepening my practice in my own personal therapy and other things, and sort of has opened up at another level some things that I had been working on, and it's very exciting. So I want to talk with you about that as well. But that's the thing I would say is sort of up for me. New level of depth and a new level of excitement.
I love that. What a great question you said it was a friend that asked you
that
question?
It was someone who was talking with me about the book.
What a great question. Because then it just points to the fact that we're constant learners and that we're constantly on the path, but that we don't arrive at a destination.
Totally. Yeah. Very exciting to be in that space. And I think, for all of us as men, and certainly for your listeners to see the possibility. That's kind of the main message that I have for all of us. There's great possibility.
I love that. Well, I can't wait to hear more about your current learnings, but let's first start by rewinding a little bit back to your younger years and find out about some of your early learnings. What did you learn about being a man in this world? Like growing up as a boy, who were your mentors? Who were your models of masculinity? What did you learn from those early experiences?
Well, interestingly, I didn't have, I thought about this over the years, and I really was hard pressed. I'm hard pressed to think about sort of real positive role models because I grew up in a very challenging family, where extended family and family, where most all of the characters were very sort of dramatic and emotional. Is kind of a typical, maybe Italian, second generation Italian family. And so and my mom was mentally ill, and coupled with being extremely smart. Like, she was valedictorian from every school she went to, but she had two baby boys that died, and I was the one that was left along with my sister. So I got the brunt of some very extreme behavior, obsessive compulsive behavior in her. And that was a very significant part of my sort of mapping as a child and growing up, which kind of overshadowed everything because I grew up really not having a voice. I was very, I think, sensitive and shy, and just didn't really have a good sense of myself. I think what I did learn, and I guess one seminal story for me, the earliest memory I have is when I was 5 years old, going to kindergarten, and I must have been in trouble because I didn't want to go. And I can remember, just like it was yesterday, my dad driving me up to the school, and maybe this was after one time not going in, and he drove me up, and he said, and he was going to drop me off. He said, "If you don't go in, I'm going to take you home and I'm going to whip you." And and I don't think he did that. I don't think he was that kind of a father, but I didn't go, and he did. And it was sort of like the first message of them as parents not being in touch with me as a real person and feeling. And I think that story continues for me, of the detachment from my feelings. And as I fast forward to the rest of my life, I realize that I was overly sensitive, am overly sensitive, but I'm really not very in touch with my feelings. And that's been the story. So that's one glimpse in, Travis.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And that storytelling is weaved through the book around your experience with your mom and growing up as her child. And I think there's some many powerful pieces that you learned as a child about who you were to be as a boy, as a man, from the primary woman in your life, the woman that was raising you. It's interesting how it doesn't take always necessarily the masculine or the male figure to be the one that teaches us those things, that we can learn a lot from any of the adults in our lives, no matter what their gender is.
And I don't, and I guess the other piece is, my father was very ineffectual with her. He was a great guy and people loved him, but she was not to be handled. And so it was pretty scary, being with her and also seeing how ineffective he was. He kind of went from zero to, a high level of anger with her. So I saw that was sort of the model that I saw, and that's the model I saw in most of my extended family, this extreme arguing and fighting. And I was terrified. Even to this day, just, it is absolutely real. I have a hard time sitting at a table having dinner with, folks, friends even, because I can remember back on being terrified by the fights at the extended family table. And and I mean, that's a real thing for me. Like, you wouldn't imagine that from knowing me, because I spend a lot of time in the world being with people, and and I'm relatively effective, but I have some parts that are, burnt into me from back then that just hang on.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's something that you and I connect on is that I find myself struggling when, especially in a group setting, when anger shows up, when that sort of, that kind of conflict style shows up. And I think in many ways we get the story that often men are really comfortable with anger, but there's a lot of us that are really uncomfortable with anger, that observed it and have seen the destructiveness of it rather than the constructiveness. I do think it has a divine purpose, and it's actually the thing. I spent most of my 20s fairly depressed, and connecting with my own anger and learning how to use it as a constructive force was actually what got me out of that depression. And so I do think it has an important role in our lives, and yet not all of us are comfortable with that anger piece. And a lot of us have some stories and memories that are imprinted in us that make us feel really uncomfortable sitting in those spaces with people.
And yet it is, as you noted in the preform that I filled out, was looking at, anger is one of the sort of main places I go to when I'm uncomfortable. And it's sort of like so quick and unconscious. And that's one of the things that I've really been working hard to change, is to get ahead of my activation. And just, there's this moment when you can, you have the chance to say, my blood pressure's going up, my heart's beating really fast, and I'm just feeling, so much, something, it feels like a rage. And to just press the pause button. I know it's cliche, but it's like, that's a big deal.
I'm starting
to do it. I'm starting to do it, and starting to, instead of expressing that anger and feeling, I'm starting to go inside and try to understand more about what I'm feeling. And that's like totally new behavior for me.
Yeah. That phrase you used, that phrase you used of get ahead of my activation, I like that. And I want to underline that, because I think that is so much of the work for many of us as we navigate our emotional reactivity to the world. It's pretty hard to be human right now. There's a lot going on in the world. And there's a lot of brittleness and a lot of divisiveness and a lot of anger and a lot of shadowy stuff coming to the surface. And if we can learn to get ahead of our activation and, as you said, put that pause in there, then we actually have choice over our lives rather than being hijacked by those automatic responses to things.
Yeah. And when, when it comes right down to it, what we're talking about is what was it that was that sort of the identity that we developed as young men around these kinds of things, around attachment or stuffing our feelings, and it is that stuff that in every day in the present life that comes up and causes us to act in ways that are less effective and really more in the masculine tradition of aggression and competition and acting out. So it really, in reality, if we can be aware of that and we can start to address that, that's a big deal. It's a big part of sort of the new model. The new masculine model is softening and identifying with feelings and starting to treat people differently.
Amen to that. Well, I guess we've already gotten to the end of our episode. You've already encapsulated it all so beautifully. Yeah, I think it is a big deal when we can hack that automatic response that shows up in us. And I think anger is one of the hardest ones to do that with, because it has so much energy and fire underneath it that it convinces us that it's righteous. It convinces us that there's no other appropriate response other than that response. And there are some situations in life where that is the right response to it, and that is the what needs to be expressed in that moment. I just think we've overutilized that, especially as men, and then now it becomes the the norm rather
Yeah.
than the odd situation.
Yeah, and I know, and I see it. I mean, of course, in my primary relationship with my wife Teresa, who's the most loving person and the most accountable person. But I get totally triggered, and I'll just jump right down her throat, and it's not acceptable. It really isn't acceptable. I'm really trying to do that differently.
Yeah. So where do you think for you've shared a little bit about your story as a childhood, but where do you think that anger comes from for you? Like, obviously, if it's so automatic, there's something almost like pre-verbal, almost like imprinted in your nervous system kind of thing, not a consciously thought out thing.
Yeah.
Where do you think it comes from for you?
Yeah, well, it is imprinted. It is in my body. There was a great deal of trauma, and I think it was, one of the things that I had to endure in growing up, and I'm talking about from age, I guess, 7 or 8 up to maybe even 18 or so, was because of my mother's compulsion. She is sort of like and my sister and I were the only people who she could make herself okay with. So I had to sit in a chair for hours on end and listen to her describe things for herself that were going to make her feel more comfortable with her compulsion. And if you could imagine sitting in a chair for hours on end, being tormented, I think I just had this incredible anger inside of me that festered. Yet I didn't really know I was powerless. I didn't know what to do with it. And I think that is the anger that is in my body.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of your childhood might have taught you the message, whether it was the intentional message that your parents were trying to teach you, but it wasn't. It was like almost like it wasn't about you. It was about them and their projections. Like
exactly.
having a mom that has lost two boys before you, that's traumatic in itself. And I would imagine she couldn't see you for you. She saw you as a representation of the loss in some ways.
It's exactly what my therapist says.
Yeah.
And and everybody has their own version of that, Travis. And that's my version, and it's real. It's there. It's in my body. It's not an excuse. It just is what has followed me around in my life for a long time. And I developed a lot of workarounds, and I write about a lot of those workarounds in the book. Many are have motivated me. It's sort of like I had this ball and chain around me, and I was constantly trying to upgrade myself and work around it. And I did a pretty good job, but it was hard because I never really addressed what I know now to be more the root problem, which is that trauma.
Yeah, it's so easy, I think, for us as men that are like, what's the problem and what's the solution? We look for those like quick fixes and those things that work around the issue. Mm-hmm. And because many of us are not that comfortable with our own emotional expressions, don't even necessarily know what our feelings are all the time because we've stuffed them most of our lives, we are constantly working around ourselves rather than actually getting intimate with that part of ourselves that is stuck.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, I've read this, I've studied it. I went on to get a PhD in psychology because my mother's psychiatrist she told me, of course, that I was going to be crazy like her. So I decided I was going to get ahead of the curve.
But work around this one.
No, you can work around this one. It didn't really work all that well, actually, because there's a difference between having it in your head. I understood a lot of things, but I never really figured out how to make it work. Now, having said that, I did pretty well in my life with that crutch that I carried around with me, or cross that I carried around with me would be another way, or ball and chain. But sort of back to your original question, which is, I don't know where the impetus in me came from to do it differently, because she wanted me to stay in her house my whole life and be a fireman like my father was, and not go to college, not do anything, and I don't know where the impetus to do that differently came from, quite frankly. And I don't know where it comes from in, challenged childhoods or, abusive childhoods or disadvantaged people. I don't know where that comes from, but it came from somewhere in me, and I'm very grateful For whatever reason that came in me, I just saw that I could do something differently. And I was feel very, very blessed to have had the life I've had. And yet I see, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was I wanted to tell that story because everybody has their own version of that. And there's a way, there's a way to be there's a way to have a better life. That's not the answer. There's a better way.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you. You clearly state that you don't necessarily know what the impetus for that change was, but how would you describe the change that you've been on so far in your adult male journey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would say, it was right after my divorce from Thurza, who was the mother of 2 children that we had, and wonderful person again. And I just was so uncomfortable with myself and I just was acting out in ways that I'm not proud of. And there I was, and divorced and sad, that had happened, and was going through therapy and, was learning about myself and trying to patch things back together again. And I met Teresa, who was my second wife, my current wife, for 30 years. We've been together now. A couple of years after that, and it wasn't that far after that, maybe 6 months, a year in, that I realized that I was feeling the same things I felt the first time. And that's, the expression, wherever you go, there you are, comes from. And there I was. And I realized that was a real hard hit because, I knew that there was something going on inside of me that was really scrambling my brain.
Yeah, it's hard when you recognize that you can't really put it on the outside circumstances.
Exactly.
Because you're the only common denominator in this situation.
Exactly. And that was, the wake-up call, the midlife crisis, or whatever it is for the men listening. There's something that happens on the outside that is untenable, and you have to do something about it. You don't want to, but you have to. Now, I read a book at that point that really changed a lot. It was called The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, who's very popular in the 50s in the United States, speaking all over the country in that arena, and was teaching people about meditation and reverence and many other things. And so I started my spiritual meditation practice, and that helped me a lot. That was a big sort of element in my journey to sort of slow myself down and start to look at myself more deeply. And then Teresa and I started doing really intense work together on our own relationship and our own individuality. Things like emotional release work, hitting pillows and, saying things to the other person that were maybe, we wouldn't normally say because we push them inside of ourselves. But one of the things I found, Travis, was that when you give emotional energy to things, then they're outside of you and it starts to dissipate a little bit, and then you can sort of work through things. So I was learning about things like that got me on a better part, and I was able to really navigate the relationship in a much more, effective manner. So that was a turning point for me.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it in the book. As you were talking about your spiritual practice that you started at that time, and that mindfulness, meditation, that kind of stuff can really bring you into. I find that interesting, and I think you bring it up in the book about how we can engage in those practices similarly to what you were talking about before about a workaround to our behavior. Mm-hmm. Or it can be a process of deepening our relationship to self. It can be just another one of those workarounds.
Totally.
Without addressing anything. Just one of those coping strategies that help us not really address it and actually continue to avoid the root cause. How did you find that balance, or how did you shift out of it from being just a way of coping with your feelings to actually allowing it to teach you something about yourself?
Well, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that meditation does is it does allow you to slow your brain down, literally slow your brain down. And so that you actually can be less reactive. And actually, I think that sort of balance and really helped me to gain more perspective. So it's about kind of creating more space so that you have more perspective to be able to make better choices and to be more present in what's happening. So I was finding some space there and finding some success in that. But I think that, to your point, I don't think I really addressed the root cause, which was really much more in the psychological arena, which, the way I, kind of describe that in the book is around what I would call sort of the core wound that each of us has, both men and women, that is sort of a driving force in our lives, sometimes propelling us to greatness, and oftentimes the shadow side of that is really limiting us. And so I think in reality, everything we do without addressing that root cause and understanding that deeply is going to be a workaround in some way. Not that it's not helpful, it's certainly helpful. All of the things that we're talking about are going to be helpful, but I don't think that you can get where you want to get to without addressing some of the sort of critical attachment wounds that you have in your body, or paradigms that were acculturated into you as a man and in your childhood sort of experience.
It's so interesting because this is the conversation that I'm having with a lot of my clients these days. And I'm actually about to teach a class, a continuing education class for the coach training that I teach for, all around attachment styles. Because I do think that really, I think it goes underrepresented how often those even pre-verbal experiences of attachment and safety in relationship with another being, or the ability to be connected to one's own needs in relationship to the adults in your lives, how much that we carry those imprints with us, and how much they impact our relationship to self, our attachments to the work we're doing in the world, our attachments to our relationships in the world. And so slowing it down and actually checking in with what is our tendencies or our patterns when we're in attachments. Are we somebody that avoids and abandons? Are we somebody that anxiously attaches to things and tries to enmesh? How do we tend to cope in our attachment with people? And as you were saying, I guess maybe sometimes the workaround strategy is just a stage of development, or it's just a step in the direction of being able to start addressing the core wound. If I can manage the day-to-day pieces every once in a while, maybe it gives me a little bit more space to actually do that deeper reflection.
Perhaps, yeah.
Because I notice that in myself is that, like, when I engage in meditation and mindfulness practice, it's often trying to soothe myself. It's not actually really trying to engage in a practice that is about long-term wellness. It's about an acute soothing.
It's more. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. So I started to really study this, and if our listeners really want to get more information about this, Dr. Terry Real, R-E-A-L, wrote a wonderful book called I Don't Want to Talk About It, where he talks about core attachments. And then, of course, Dan Brown, who's a Harvard psychiatrist, did seminal research in the area of attachment theory. Interestingly, he describes, as you described, Travis, these sort of two stages where attachment happens in a young boy's life. The first one is before the age a year and a half. And the second one is, I think, by the age 3. The first one is more the sort of, are you experiencing real love and, closeness to your primary caregivers? And then the second one is more about the viewpoints that you get, your paradigms of how the world operates based on the acculturation that you go through. Now, that's really important stuff, because it is literally the map that you develop and drive, and it's continually reinforced. Your paradigm is continually reinforced as you go through life. And that core attachment as a male, that acculturation, is really the thing that then becomes what it means to be defined as the masculine. And that certainly is something that, it's unconscious. We're not really aware of it. That's the part that's most difficult, is we think, oh, that's the way we should be.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's what makes it such a complex issue, because these are things that are experienced in a child's mind and in a child's nervous system that isn't necessarily attached to thought and language in the same way that we as adults really lean into thought and language. And so awareness work is really important to have awareness of those sort of primary experiences. And there's some work you can do at the level of the mind and choosing your thoughts and perspective shifting around certain things. But until you actually address the embodied experience of the little boy and help him update his strategies that he had developed in that child's mind, it's really hard to do anything other than be reactive or to just stuff your feelings.
Exactly. So being, that presence is really what it's all about. It's like that being present and saying, okay, here it is. It's coming up. So I was actually playing around with this just before I talked with you, and the more I've been thinking about what I've been calling these success pillars. So think about this. So like to be able to actually sort of pull through this sort of core dynamic that we're talking about and the resulting sort of behavior patterns that develop, there are several things that have to happen. One, you have to be able to sort of see and feel. In the book, I call it emotional acuity, or even self-awareness. You have to be able to see and feel or get some feedback from the environment as to what's happening inside of you, but also how you're actually acting outside of you. That's number one. And then you have to choose to open. You have to choose and say, okay, I want to take a look at this, like what's happening. Like what I'm doing is not cool. I need to take a look at this. That's step 2. And step 3 is, I think you have to learn. There's some learning. Like what we're talking about are things you and I have been learning about, right? You have to open up some learning. And in the book, I try to share some things that I learned about that will help you in this sort of process that we're in. But the next part of it after learning is you have to make a choice to engage in healing. So you have to address the trauma in your body, because the trauma in your body is the thing that is actually driving everything. And then the last part is really more about sort of deepening and integrating it and holding yourself more accountable. So I don't think you could get through this without going through some of those sort of what I'm calling these success pillars.
Yeah, I so agree with you on that. And I think it's really interesting you talk about this element of like engaging in a healing journey around it. And yet, in some ways, that's so counterculture for us as men, because we're actually, those formative experiences, we were just taught to like not feel our feelings and it's not so bad and just keep moving and harden up and be a man about it and all those kinds of things. And so to admit that there is something broken that needs healing is so counter to our culture and so counter to our socialization. And yet, I think you're right that it is what's locked in the body that is driving us. That it's not a conscious thing. It's below that level. It's a deeper ingrained pattern.
So that's the that's really the critical sort of portion of this whole thing. I think it's like what's going to drive you to the doorstep of change. What's going to drive you to the doorstep of looking at yourself, not just looking at yourself and saying, of course, that's how I operate in the world, and rational, what Harville Hendricks calls microscopic truth. Non-microscopic truth is rationalizing behavior, which we can all do. Microscopic truth is where you look at the honesty of what's really happening. And until you get to that point, you're forever doomed in this doom loop that you're in. So getting to that place that you're describing to me is like I'm at that place now. What I do with it is another story. That's the place that I hope for your listeners and for people reading my book.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up this terminology of emotional acuity. It's something I've been describing in my work that I love taking men out and doing the horse work that I do, the equus coaching work that I do, because I don't think as men we're taught to really connect to ourselves or to be able to sense what's going on in others. That's not we don't teach little boys how to do that. We teach little girls how to. We teach them to be caregivers. We give them dolls to play with. We give them their activities are much more relational in the way that they talk to each other. And so we don't really give boys that. We don't ask them to practice that skill set. But being in a round pen with a horse that has a flighty nervous system that is a prey animal, that we get to see how we show up impacts the external environment in real time, it helps develop that emotional acuity to be able to sense what's going on in me, also to be able to sense what's going on in another, to be able to reflect on, is my intention that I'm bringing into this relationship actually having the impact that I'm looking for or not? That's what I love, that work. And so I'm just so grateful that the book had it in there and that you're talking about it here, because it puts language to something I've been trying to describe for a while about one of the things that is important to develop for us as men.
Beautiful. I love that. I think that's exactly it. And one of the things that I know I'm an overly sensitive person.
Same.
Very sensitive to, join the crowd, right?
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a curse, and I'm always, kind of looking, what are they doing? What are they thinking? What's going on here? What's going on there? And I get angry at people because they're not like, most people aren't like that, I find. It's all about.
I'm just laughing because I don't know that I've ever heard someone describe my experience so well.
Well, there you go.
I see myself in you in this moment. Wow.
Yeah, well, I actually have one other really good friend who is exactly like this, and he describes it to me, and it's even a more extreme version of me, and it seems so ridiculous when he talks about it, but it's like I do that too. So I think that I want that, I think where it comes from in me is that I want to be seen by other people. Because I think I never really was seen by my parents. So I'm looking to be seen. And when I'm not seen in the way that I want to be seen, I just get so angry and frustrated, and I just want to run and get out. I want to split. I basically say, I don't want any part of this. But I think you're right that, I don't think anything happens for a man until you have that emotional acuity, because otherwise you're just basically, your come from is totally arrogant and narcissistic. It's all about me. It's like, I'm going to do this. Whatever that horse, I don't care what that horse needs. I'm going to ride the horse. I'm going to break that horse. I can do me. And that's kind of, I think, a very masculine approach to relating or trying to collaborate or whatever it is. It's like, we don't do that. I don't do that. I pushed through everything in my life. Everything was a competition. Everything was a win. Everything was about power. And that I come by that legitimately. We all do as men, I think. Most of us. I'm not everyone, of course.
I do think there's some element of our sort of socialization as boys that maybe not intentionally, but starts to separate us from others and starts to see others as objects within the landscape rather than as beings with intrinsic need and value and sovereignty. It's like we get just enough distance away from it so that there's something I need to conquer or something I need to win against or have more power over. Yep. And so I do think there is a huge piece of our socialization as men that we're overcoming. And I also appreciate that, even as you were talking about the emotional acuity piece, that it is something that we are encouraging men to develop, but there's also a shadow side of that for men like you and I who have overdeveloped that skill maybe, and it becomes a codependency thing, or it becomes a coping strategy from the moments you weren't seen as a child. It's like, that it's not that that this is the best thing that there could ever be. It just means that even this has to have an artful hand in using.
Totally.
Because as I was reading that section of the book, that's what I thought. I was like, oh, I've got that, and I have it on overdrive. I can see where it comes from shadow sometimes, and where it gets in the way, rather than actually as a beneficial thing too.
Totally. My wife would always describe it to me as, well, you're just giving your power away. You're giving too much power to these other people. And I just like, I never could understand it. I'm starting to see it a little differently now. Now, and I also know that how I show up makes a big difference in how other people perceive me, as well. So, I mean, there's so many layers to this. It's just, but the point is that nothing happens until you make a decision until you really make a decision to look at what's really happening. And so it's sort of like to get to the doorstep of change, usually for people, it's more based on some trauma or illness or divorce, or I lost my job, or I've got cancer, or my kids hate me. And maybe, if you get that shell knocked down enough, you'll start saying, is it maybe something in me? Which is a hard lesson for, I think, a man to take. But, for many of us, that's what it takes. And then we actually open up and start to look at ourselves. And the beautiful thing about it is there's so much to be gained. There's so much of a different world inside of yourself and outside of yourself that we just don't, that landscape we just don't know about.
So you were talking at the very beginning of our conversation about you kind of reached that doorstep of change not after writing this book, and that you've had some learning since this book, and that you've sort of committed to your own personal work. Share with me a little bit about what you've been currently working on as a man in this world.
Yeah, well, I think, what I've realized was that there are really three sort of fundamental sort of approaches that you can take once you have this level of self-awareness and you decide to take yourself on, which is a big deal. One portal is sort of behavioral portal. You can say, okay, I'm going to start to really look at my behavior patterns, and I'm going to try to alter some of those. That would be more of like a cognitive behavioral approach to change. I write about that in the book in terms of the moments of truth, where there's a stimulus response, try to do something differently. You learn new skills, you learn to listen differently. That would be one way and that's great. The second way I would say would be more of a spiritual approach, where you really start to get deeper into your own values, into more your own set of intentions, meditation, maybe prayer, where you start to soften and really start to understand what's in your heart, and that opens you up to some extent. Once again, fantastic. The third element is really the more sort of psychological approach to this change. And that would be more of a therapeutic model, where you're actually understanding the trauma and origins of your core dynamic. And you're actually starting to work on dissipating that in your body and dissolving it in your life, and coming to grips with how it's been actually driving your behavior patterns. That's the work that I'm engaged in right now at this stage. And this is a later stage for me. I took a crack at it earlier on when I was in my mid-30s, but I don't think I was really sophisticated enough to really take it on myself. And now I'm starting to get it. And so that's the approach that I'm taking, Travis. And I really think all three of those are needed to both learn about and actually experientially practice. I think it probably needs you need a coach to do that. It's not something you can necessarily, I did a lot of it on my own through learning and, just doing it, but I don't think I really got as far as I could have if I really decided to, because I think there was a part of me that resisted. Well, the part of me that was my masculinity was saying, you can do this. Mm-hmm. You can push through this yourself. Mm-hmm. And my wife was always saying, if you want to be good at anything, get a coach.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was a soft way of dealing with it. So that's what I'm doing right now. And it's really helping.
A soft way of dealing with it. I love that. That's what comes up for so many of us when we think about asking for help or bringing someone in to help us move through these things. It comes across as a soft approach.
Exactly.
I appreciate you laying those things out, because it's something that I find myself trying to always strike a balance in. I think the first one that you described, which about like learning new behaviors and learning new ways of thinking, more of that cognitive behavioral approach that feels a little aligned with traditional coaching styles. And then there's the style that you were talking about at the end that's the more psychological or therapeutic approach, which happens to have the more therapy side of things. And I'm constantly trying to find that balance in my work with clients and in my own relationship to self, because sometimes it's about action and taking steps in the present to shift your situation. And sometimes it's about addressing the past. And I float the line as a coach a little bit more than a lot of coaches do, because I have a master's in social work and have brought in some of that therapeutic element of it, even though I'm not a therapist. But I am always trying to find that line and I find that in myself too. And I think you're right that we do need to have somebody in our lives that can be that outside force, because you can do a lot of the work individually, reading a book, meditating, being present with yourself. But so many of the things that are trapped in our body were created in relationships with other people. And therefore, it can't fully resolve or get new experiences or learn something new without someone else's nervous system to regulate with or to get dysregulated because of. Like, we actually need that back and forth in order to be able to really do this work, I think.
Yeah. And in addition, because we are social creatures, learning happens in relationship, but also in support. Like, that's why men's groups or, therapy groups are really helpful to just to know that you're not the only one feeling something or thinking something, and that, people's experience going through things is so helpful. I recently had a friend of mine beautiful person who was, had 3 young kids and called me and said he was really feeling like he was losing his relationship with his wife. And, I asked him if we could talk about it for real. And because I knew that he took it pretty seriously. And I shared with him my experience, and because I had gone through the same thing, and what I thought, sort of what some things that he could do that would be a way station, because I think as men, we think about going from A to Z. It's like, I'm done, boom, I'm out of here. And he's really been able to pull it back. And I'm just so grateful, for him. And, and I'm not sure, again, what he would have done if he hadn't had that conversation.
Yeah, so for you, how did you get over that hump for yourself in looking at something as a soft approach to hire a coach or to ask for help in these areas? How did you get yourself over that hump?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was actually, my wife sort of dragged me to this retreat center where mostly there were women down in Mexico about 4 or 5 months ago. And I met some incredible women. And if they're listening to this, they'll know who they are. They actually are from your area. They were wonderful teachers at the retreat center. And I had a conversation with one of them, and she had read my book. And I said, I'm really trying to figure out what to do here, how I can really bring this into the world. And she said, you need to do your work on yourself. And I realized, obviously, when you make a public statement by writing a book, I put it all out there. It's like I couldn't not do the work. So I decided to do the work based on her recommendation and also my own realization that this was the time to do this. Now, I'm a little embarrassed about that because, I'm not a spring chicken. I've been through a lot, and my hope, Travis, is that people listening to this would decide to take themselves on earlier in their life, because it's imminently possible to improve ourselves. And it takes a bit of a leap of faith for men, I think, to do that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that honest emotional response you have to your own work at this age. I think that's a common thing that we all feel as embarrassment, or I should have known better sooner, I should have done better before.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be really easy to feel shame or to feel embarrassment about where we are with our journeys, especially like you said, you put a book out there and then you do your personal work on a deeper level. But I also think, as I sort of said in the beginning of this, I think it's actually part of the magic of the work of your book is that you show up as the learner and as the teacher all at the same time.
I love that.
And I think that we have enough of those sort of like gurus on the hill where people are following them and they've supposedly reached a destination that we're all striving for. And yet, in my personal experience working with people pretty high up in the self-help world, they're just as flawed of human beings as the rest of us. And some are choosing to do their work and some are choosing to avoid their work in their own personal work in the work they're doing in the world.
Exactly.
And so I actually feel safer and a relief hearing your vulnerability around that and recognizing your own journey, because then now I get to see myself in your journey and also see my strengths in my journey. Mm-hmm. But I also get to know that somebody else is on the journey and it continues to unfold, rather than that I'm supposed to get to this destination that feels unachievable to me. So I hear that embarrassment and I want to sort of honor it and also reflect back that it's the thing that I enjoy most about your work is that you showed up as both the learner and the teacher.
I love that. That was the thing that resonated with me that I meant at the beginning when you said teacher learner, because I think that's what it's always about, isn't it? I mean, I think, it's a constant renewable practice. And we're just deepening and deepening and deepening. And, how lovely a podcast like this, and so thankful for you and doing this work to be able to bring people into the conversation. Because there's no other way, to find out about it. How do you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest point of this podcast is it's an invitation. It's modeling intimacy between men. It's modeling like seeing each other's humanity even if we disagree. It's taking accountability and ownership for the things that are not working about being a man in this world, but then also just as equally looking forward and painting a picture together, a new picture together. And so it is an invitation for people, and they don't have to come if they don't want to, but it is an invitation, and I'm just grateful that other men, I thought it was going to be a lot harder to find other men that were doing this work too, and just men like you being willing to show up has been just as much a part of my own healing journey as it is about the work I'm doing in the world as well.
And thank you, and I'm so eager to be in that conversation with other men too. And doing, thankfully from you and from other people, I'm starting to get into a network of people who actually are, thought leaders in this, as you are, and that's really lovely for me. And I'm getting a lot of really positive feedback in the way that you're describing it. But I want the listeners to know also that, I'm like your typical sort of, male, guy. I mean, I just like, I'm very competitive athletically. I love to win. I've been a tremendous achiever in my work. I love to make a sale. I mean, all of the things that your listeners are probably thinking, I'm a guy, I want to do this and do that. I mean, I'm all about that stuff. But I do it, it's not like I really want to kill people. I just want to, I just love, the hunt and achieving. I just want people to know that that's who I am. Now, I also have a very soft side of myself like you do. But the stuff we're talking about is at another level than all of that. It's like, that's all external stuff. It's all the manifestation of the stuff that's inside of you, whether it be my sensitivity on a positive side or negative, or my achievement on a positive side or negative. I know that all of that was driven from something inside of me. And until I can figure that stuff out, I'm going to be at its mercy. Some good, some bad, but I want more good. That's the life well lived.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit, if you still have some energy for it, let's talk a little bit more about the book and what you lay out as your life well lived, the journey towards that. One of the things that really stuck out to me that I don't know that many people have awareness of, and it's talked about deeper in the book, was the sort of the stages of adult development. And like the percentages of people that are kind of locked in certain developmental stages than others. So Do you know who does the research? I'm not remembering it off the
It's
top of
Robert
my-
Keegan, Dr. Robert Keegan, who's a Harvard psychologist.
Yeah. And so there's the impulsive mind, the imperial mind, the socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and the self-transforming mind. So the sort of latest stage of development, the one that is sort of the furthest along, only about 1% of the adult population sort of ever gets to that place where they're go beyond just self-authoring into self-transforming. Can you describe the difference between self-authoring and transforming a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, before I do that, I do want to say that this research was really, I mean, it was like so mind-opening to me to think that, as humans, because we read a lot about childhood development through Piaget and people like that, but this is more like we're developing our whole lives. And there's some, like, for those of your listeners who are listening who are in leadership positions, I mean, this research has, upwards of 1 million people in the research sample, some of the top leaders in our country. And in the research, only, I think it was about 30% of the people who took the test, both male and female, scored in the stage which is called self-authoring. Only 1%, like the top, were in this sort of transformative stage. So this is a big deal. Let me just describe the difference between the socialized mind. The socialized mind is basically us in real life operating based on our ego. Our ego is saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, and you're trying to please or keep yourself safe. That's where the majority of the people seem to be operating. Okay, and you can see why we've got some of the challenges in our work or in our relationships. The self-authoring stage is where you actually sort of realize that you can make a different choice based on your own values and that you can be safe and effective in operating in a way that is based on those values. The difference between a self-authoring stage and the transformative stage, one of the most practical ways I can think about it is in this. People who are in the transformative stage are able to hold two belief systems at the same time and not feel that they need to be binary in that holding of those choices. So think about that. It's like, I love the New England Patriots, and I can't possibly love the New York Giants because they're the arch enemy, or my religion, or my country, or my politics. Think about it. The majority of us recognize based on this binary approach. But in reality, to get to a higher level of existence and solution in any kind of negotiation or war and peace or business negotiation, you have to be, if you can hold more than one belief system and try to look for the best in the third alternative, that's what the transformative mind, it's an example of what the transformative mind does, Travis. So I don't know if that describes an example of the difference. It's very amazing and very powerful research.
Yeah, I was fascinated. I know enough about some of this stuff, but I hadn't seen the numbers sort of pan out like this. And that first one you described of the socialized mind, that 58% of the adult population is in there, really just focus on my needs and how do I get to my needs, basically.
Exactly.
And also like influenced by those around you in terms of what your values and beliefs and thoughts are, rather than that self-authoring, which is internally defined in some ways.
Exactly.
And so it's wild to think about that 58% of the adult population, the majority of them of us are walking out around the world not really self-authoring. Even some of the people that maybe believe they are self-authoring are really still in that socialized mind. But what you were describing about the self-transforming mind, about that being able to hold two truths and find a third option, it's what I often talk about with my clients when they hit that place in their life when they're at a paradox where they have two belief systems that seem like they believe in both of them and yet they don't seem like they can fit in the same reality. I always encourage people to sit with that longer. to let that tension build, to let
Beautiful.
develop something within you, because when they do start to lock into place and can coexist, to me, that's where the most magic in life happens. That's where the most life well lived happens, is when that click, that rub process into the click. And so it's what and it's not something I'm always fantastic at myself. It's something that I continue to learn. Would it be accurate to say that in the same sort of like relative time frame, you can exhibit different styles of thinking and minds across those, that you're not just, I've arrived as a self-transforming mind and I never slip back?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. But like anything else, your legacy, who you are and how people see you, is sort of the sum total of those moments of truth and how you make decisions. And when you take a survey, like you can actually take a survey that I think I have a link to in the book, or information about the link, it's helping you arrive at your overall patterns. It's pretty interesting stuff. And think about this. It's easy for you and I to talk about it, for other people, like it's easy to coach people on something like this. But when you're in the heat of battle, or like in the Ukrainian situation, when you're trying to negotiate, life and death and territory, it's a lot easier to dig in on your needs, rather than to look at, holding these two tensions and, and coming and being mature about that. That's why negotiation is so hard. And in the thick of the battle, it's the most difficult.
And it's a thing I'm really fascinated as we continue watching conflict arise in our world, is there are certain topics that form, like as an individual, that are pretty binary, that are not room for a gray area or for a third solution. Like I was just I was talking with somebody that was potentially going to be a guest on the podcast, and he held some what felt like pretty homophobic viewpoints. And as a gay man myself, it was going to be very hard to sit in that conversation for me and to offer this to my community where there's a conflict around that, because it's deeply attached to my identity and worth as a being. And so there does feel like those times where life gets really binary, and it does become that heat of the battle, and what's the choice I'm going to make around this. And so I'm fascinated by these kinds of things where sometimes it feels like, and I don't know, I'm not at a place where I'm resolved around it. I still believe there are certain things that it is a binary choice, that it is yes or no. Yeah. It's not that third option.
It's what Joseph Campbell calls the inner reaches of outer space in his book, The Hero's Journey. That inner reaches of outer space. That's the outer space that's possible for all of us. That's why I believe this. The work that you're doing and the work that I outline in the Journeyman Life book is so important, because change is needed in our systems, and we see incredible signs of the need. Yet system change is really hard, and really the main thoroughfare is through individual change. So it all starts from each one of us making a different choice, going through the process you and I are talking about today. That's how change happens.
It's how I love to imagine the work that I keep doing in the world is like you create shifts and change on an individual level, and then the ripple of that, and then the ripple of that. Like teaching a coach training, teaching other coaches how to offer work that helps others do that. It just keeps rippling out for that. And I don't know, it reminds me of when I was going through my social work program, and I had to sort of decide on a pathway. Was I going to go direct practice or more like macro level social work? And I just never, I think there's total value in macro level social policy changing versions, but I just had, I could not get myself to go in that direction. It was, I want to be in the trenches with someone. I want to be direct practice and finding out how to make that kind of an impact. I'm also grateful that there are people that want to do the macro level stuff, but what you're saying is like, I really value that major highway that is to social change, is to individually create change and do our own healing work.
And our leaders, are tremendous. They have a tremendous leverage. And I've never seen a system change, and that's the work I do in my real life, without a leader changing.
Mm-hmm.
When the leader changes, everything changes. It's true for your family. It's true for your relationships. You can change your relationships. You can change your family. You can change anything if you change.
Yeah, I think about it. Sometimes I do. I've done workshops doing the horse work that I do in leadership development or in nonprofit leadership development, and oftentimes the executive director or CEO wants to bring somebody in to work on their leaders, but then they won't do the work too.
Yeah,
and then you just watch how some things can change and shift, but real change happens when they're ready to get engage as well and be vulnerable and own their stuff and see where they're still growing.
Totally. Yeah. I find the same thing is true.
Yeah.
But I had one leader that I worked with on a very large change effort. I'll never forget it. He called me into his office, and I thought I was going to get bounced. I was a consultant. This was when newspapers were going through real change and they were dropping off, and he was the head of a newspaper. Called me into his office and he said, "I want you to sit down." And he looked at me and he said, "I need help." He said, "Because I'm having a terrible time dismantling this organization." And they needed to cut about a third of their, staff. And I worked with him over the course of a year. And we hardly ever talked about the organization changes. We talked about him. And ultimately he was able to pull it off. And to this day, that newspaper still exists.
What a beautiful story. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it gives permission for other male leaders to be doing the same thing, to really start to do their own personal work. If there's external flux and external challenges that are happening, what would be the benefit if we actually turned inward and stopped trying to manage the chaos out there, and you actually got internally centered, got internally in that right relationship with yourself, where you're actually hearing yourself, slowing it down, listening, interrupting that reactivity pattern that can show up for many of us. What a beautiful permission.
Yeah, and it's magical. It's magical, and it's a beautiful thing when you see it, but it's available.
Yeah, so I just have really appreciated our conversation, getting to explore who you are as just an individual man. What are the stories that are important to you that grew you into the man that you are? Getting to hear more about the learning that you're continuing to dive into for yourself. And especially for the book, The Journeyman Life, The Not So Perfect Path to a Life Well Lived. I think you, as I've said it before, you've done such a beautiful job of showing up as the learner and as the teacher, and I just encourage more men to show up in that way. It will be a safer, more sustainable world for all of us if we're able to be in both spaces at once and to be able to value both. If you were going to give men one piece of advice leaving this conversation, what might that piece of advice be?
Yeah, thank you, Travis. So I think it would be that there's a whole other world that's possible outside of the current reality that you're experiencing. And there's a whole other world inside of you to be explored. And that's really amazing when you think about it. And here I am in my 70s, finding parts out about myself that are having such an incredibly positive impact on my life and my well-being. So I think the main message I would like to leave is that there's that possibility for each and every one of you listening to have that upgrade in your operating system and having a much better life. And quite honestly, the earlier you can do that, the better off you are, because you have more of a chance to live that life. Mm-hmm. But also, any time in your life is the right time to do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think we are where we are, and we can only start with right now. And the fact that you're still doing that in your 70s is so inspirational, because so often I think we get into that resignation. It's like, this is just who I am, and people around me have to deal with it. And I just have to deal with it. And yet what you're finding is there's even newer layers here for you that can improve the quality of your inner and your outer life.
Yeah, the biggest potential problem is when we start to see ourselves as finished, fait accompli, and I'm done, and this is just who I am.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the worst thing you can think for yourself, and probably the worst thing your partners can hear from you as well.
I was going to say, I was like, how many people have heard that from a man in their life?
Totally.
This is just who I am.
I'm done. Yeah, that's who I am.
So true. Well, if people were interested in finding out more about the book, finding out more about you, how might they do so in the world?
Yeah, thank you. Well, our website is thejourneymanlife.com, and we've got lots of information there about the book and about workshops and other information about this movement. And then, of course, the book is available on Amazon and in Barnes & Noble and other booksellers. The Journeyman Life, The Not So Perfect Path to a Life Well Lived.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that those are linked in the show notes so that people can easily access it as well. I've just had such a really nice time connecting with you. I've just appreciated being able to take part in your work, but then also to be able to share it and to just be in conversation and connection with you as a man.
And you as well, Travis. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and interaction. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And your audience, hopefully.
Thanks for saying that. If people want to get in connection with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com, or you can find me on Instagram at Travers03. That's where a lot of the ongoing conversations around the podcast are going on. So if you want to participate in an active way, please find me on Instagram at Travers03. I'm also on Patreon. You can become a contributor to the podcast and support the mission of the podcast by going to patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thank you again so much, Tony, for your time and for your work in the world. I am just so grateful to be in a space of intimacy with you and to be able to welcome you into the New Masculine.
And me as well. Thank you.